So in this video, I want to talk about my top 5 crops for a survival garden. The whole focus of this video is the 5 crops for me that grow very easily, especially up in northern climates like zone 6, 7, where I'm at. And so basically the criteria to determine my top 5 crops is how easy are they to grow, the type and quality of the food value that they give, if they have less pest or disease issues than some other crops, length of growing season or tolerance of cold conditions, right? And also if the crops are at least relatively low maintenance. All right, so those are the top characteristics that I have in mind when determining these top 5 crops. Now let's get into the top 5 crops. So I want to start this list off by talking about sorghum, right? It's a really energy dense grain that's fairly easy to grow in a bunch of different climates, especially closer to tropical areas and even up into some northern climates as well. Like here in this zone 6 to 7 climate, it grows really well, and I've had a lot of success growing it. So there are a bunch of different cool things to like about the sorghum, right? Usually, in terms of survival crops, I really like the idea of perennials, but it can also be helpful to mix in some annuals as well. Because when you look at natural systems, they have perennials, but they also have some annuals. So it's always good to try to maintain that balance on various areas of the landscape. So sorghum is drought resistant, right? It seems to be a lot more drought resistant than corn. Overall, it's a lot easier of a crop to grow than corn, right? It tends to be a lot more productive, especially on poor soils. And as I said, it's very drought resistant, right? You don't usually have to irrigate sorghum like you do some other garden plants. And so this is a grain. It's in the grass family, but this has pretty large seeds, right? It's not quite as large as corn, but it's larger than some other seeds, and they're pretty easy to work with, right? They don't have to be winnowed like oats do, or like wheat or rye. So they can be a lot more of an efficient grain to grow and harvest, right, for less work. And in these challenging weather conditions, the sorghum can still be very productive, producing a bunch of seed that is easy to work with, right? So this can be a pretty good, reliable crop that we can use to kind of fall back on. The stems of the immature sorghum plants can also be pressed for their syrup, or pressed to produce a juice that can be turned into a syrup, and that can have all kinds of different uses. It can be added also to different foods to add some sweetness to foods that might otherwise not taste that great. The stalks can also be used, of course, as a building material, making baskets. I've used them as making like basket type cages around plants during the wintertime to protect them from animals, and I've had some pretty good success with that. This is a plant that has also been used as a cover crop, right? Because it is very good at reintroducing carbon back into the soil profile. It has a pretty deep reaching root system. It can send out some exudates and may help to feed some of that soil life. A lot of these microbes really like to be in a carbon rich environment, and carbon in many ways, it's kind of like a shelter, a habitat source for them. And soils with higher carbon, like higher amounts of organic matter, can help to stabilize that subterranean environment, like especially where moisture will not fluctuate as dramatically, because soils with higher organic matter, aka higher carbon, tend to hold on to more water for a longer amount of time. So you can grow a crop and get food value out of it, but you can also benefit the soil as you are growing and harvesting that crop. And then additionally, the seed flour, if you ground it up into a powder, that can be an additive to making different types of glues or adhesives, a substance that can be used to help stick different materials together. In particular for the food from the seeds, I've used the sorghum seeds as an oatmeal substitute with a particular way I prepared them in a previous video, one I did a few years ago, and it actually tasted really good, very comparable to oatmeal. So that is definitely a really good option that can really be used as a pretty solid food source. Right, so we have some challenges, or at least things to consider when growing the sorghum. So the mature seeds can be very attractive to various animals, rodents, like, you know, and rabbits. Rabbits, I've seen, can actually bend the stalk down and eat the seeds, and that can be pretty annoying. Right, so we want to make sure that we are harvesting the grain when it's ripe on time and not any later. We don't want to wait, because that gives animals more of a chance to get to it. And then also we might want to grow these sorghum plants in between other plants, right? So they can be harder to bend down, where the leaves and stems of other plants can help to make it more challenging for other animals to maneuver the stalks of the sorghum down so they can eat the grain. And then we also want to be careful of when we're storing the seed for food, of where and how we are storing it so that animals cannot access it. In some ways, some people might be able to use the sorghum seed as a way to kind of flip it around in an advantage, as using it as a bait. Right, and also the seeds of this plant, as it is an annual, and it tends to originate from a warmer climate, a warmer season climate. The seeds will need to be stored over the winter time, so we want to make sure that we keep them protected and dry during that season until we plant them later in the spring and summer. Another thing to be careful of is, when young, the sorghum plant can look very similar to other grasses, right, when it's sprouting up. We want to make sure that we are being cognizant of where we are planting the sorghum, and maybe waiting to weed around the sorghum plants until once these sorghum plants start to grow and get larger, and then we can identify them a lot more easily from the other grasses and stuff. And then some final notes to consider are that sorghum can be pretty sensitive to windy conditions, especially because sorghum tends to be a taller plant, and also it's a warm season grass, so the farther up north you go, the less growing season you have. It seems that zone 6 to 7 for at least some of these taller varieties seems to be somewhat potentially of a limit as to them being able to bear mature seed before the end of the season. So in these cases, if we have windier conditions and or we have a colder climate, some shorter varieties of sorghum might be an option. Ones that don't grow as tall might take a little less time to mature, and they will definitely be a lot more stable, right? Because the seed head can be pretty heavy, and when that's pretty high up in the air, it's going to make that plant a lot more unstable and very prone to lodging, falling over, the stalk snapping, that types of thing. Sunchokes, or Jerusalem artichokes, are a relative to sunflowers, and these are a native plant to North America. So these plants are in the aster family, and they can function as a late season nectary for different beneficial insects during that time. So in that respect, and in others, they can help to boost ecological health. These plants grow very well in poor soil. They can actually be pretty productive under those conditions. This is a plant that is, of course, a perennial, and it can be propagated by tubers, right? So it's a really easy plant to grow and propagate, and to be able to get a harvested yield off of. You don't have to replant it every single year, and it's also fairly drought tolerant as well. Even this year, we've had a lack of rain, and even into the late summer and through the fall, we've hardly had any rain at all. Still, I am out there digging up sizable tubers, just like I have all the other years. Now, some things we want to keep in mind: deer may eat the tops as they grow, so you may want to give protection to these plants and let them get established in different areas. And then also some rodents can find their way and try to dig up some of the tubers. In general, it's usually kind of spotty and not a huge concern, but sometimes you have really high populations of voles or mice or rats or whatever. Things can get a little annoying pretty fast. Right, so this plant can also be affected by the sclerotinia rot, can affect the plant health and tuber production. So it's good to kind of rotate these crops around every few years, every couple of years, to different locations. And then if you dry the tubers, I found that they tend to rehydrate very easily, like as soon as it gets like warmer out, and when it's warmer, the air can hold more humidity, and that is taken up by the tubers, and then they really need to be used right away. Like as soon as you get into like mid-spring or so and it starts to warm up and stuff, it's good to definitely like empty out your stock and make like a whole bunch of like sunchoke soup or whatever, just so that that food doesn't get wasted. So I did debate about whether to mention sunchokes or potatoes. So I'm just going to kind of mention both of them. A lot of people like to use potatoes as like a really fundamental crop. It can be rich in calories, fairly easy to grow. Although for me, I've had challenges trying to grow potatoes successfully, whether it be drought or not great soil conditions, among some other things. But the sunchokes really seem to outproduce the potatoes, and they seem to be a lot less work as well. So I've stuck to sunchokes for these, but understanding that potatoes can be a really great crop as well. And a lot of people do use those as like a staple crop. So next up we have beans. These are a pretty common crop, and of course I'm talking about the dry beans, not so much the green beans, although it's basically the same species. So this crop has large seeds, it's easy to plant, and these plants produce a good yield in a relatively short time, right? They, over the course of a shorter season, and especially for the bush varieties, these grow low to the ground, and they tend to produce food, right, the beans, earlier than like pole varieties. And in some situations they can also be easier to manage in that sense. Beans are legumes, and they also form symbiotic relationships with different microbes that help to fix nitrogen into the soil. So these plants can grow in poor soil conditions and fare pretty well, right? Because they need to fix that nitrogen so that they can create a protein-rich food, right? These seeds are really high in protein. Protein contains nitrogen, right? And so of course this can be a protein-rich food source that we can use, especially if we combine it with like grains, maybe like sorghum. And even any bad seed, like any seed that's been eaten partially by insects, or it's been damaged or gone rancid, if it's old seed, whatever the case may be, that can also be used as a nutrient-rich fertilizer for different plants, right? Because it has a high nitrogen, organic nitrogen content in the form of amino acids. And then the seeds are, again, they're large, they're easy to harvest from the pods. So some things we might want to consider about the beans is that different types of animals can eat bean plants, right? Especially when they're younger and developing. Different, rabbits, other types of rodents, deer may also. So that's definitely one thing that you'd want to plan around. And even different insects like the seed corn maggot can get into and eat damaged seeds that are planted in the soil at certain times of the year. Also, when the plants are growing and the pods are beginning to develop and swell, certain animals can also go after the beans at this stage, right? Like the shelling bean stage, and you can get some level of crop losses from that as well. Another thing we want to consider is the pantry moth can wreak some havoc with stored seed, right, during the winter time. So that's another thing to be aware of. And just the seed storage in general over the winter time, we want to make sure that we are keeping it protected and dry. And this is another annual plant, and so those seeds will have to be collected, stored, and some of them stored for the purposes of planting the next year. Right now there are some other types of beans, right? There's the woolly bean, which is a smaller bean, but it is native to North America. That's another option. And then there is also the perennial bean, or the thicket bean, that is able to come back each year, but it can take a little bit of time to get established. And you'll have to protect that from certain animals as well, as the plant is growing and it's a vining nature, right? So you might want to cage around the base, right? So the plant doesn't get bit off from the stem at the base or anything like that. And then here we have parsnips. These are definitely probably my favorite crop on this list. These plants are biennial, but they can be grown and harvested as an annual. But if you want seed production, to be able to collect the seeds and plant those in future years, the plant will flower and go to seed in its second year. And this plant is cold tolerant, so it can overwinter even in tough, cold and northern climates. This plant, when it's in flower, again in its second year, is really great for beneficial insects, a wide variety of them. and so it can really benefit natural pest control and pollination in a garden or landscape. So these plants can self-seed. However, when they do set seed and the seed lands on the ground, that is usually late summer, early fall, and the plants don't really have much of a chance to grow. They will sprout in the fall, but and they can overwinter, but the plants won't get super large, and usually the roots won't get super big either, because the plants aren't really established before winter. Usually what I do is I will collect a bunch of the seed and I will plant that in the early spring of that next growing season, usually between February and March, and that gives the parsnips an entire season to grow and get established, so I can get a good harvest. So the roots, they can be stored as they are, you know, in the garden, in the ground, or other things like a root cellar. And the parsnips can also be dried, right? And I did a bunch of this last year, and it worked out pretty well. They taste pretty good. They can add some sweetness to different dishes, to soups, as dried, and those can be kept throughout the winter time and added to all those different dishes. So the parsnip in general, it can be added to soups and whatnot, but I really like it roasted, and I've also made some especially good hummus out of it as well. Different types of dips, those types of things. And the cool thing about this plant too is that it produces a lot of seeds. It's easy to collect a lot of seeds in a short amount of time, and those can then be planted in the spring. The roots also, they're pretty deep tap roots, and they can help to decompact the soil, provide aeration and channels for water to infiltrate and penetrate, get into the soil profile. And the leaves of the parsnip, I've also eaten. They're edible, and especially like earlier in the spring, they can be added to like soup stocks. They can be eaten raw as well, but they do kind of have a strong flavor, so they might be best used as like a spice or an herb type thing, not so much like a salad green. So some things to consider here, you know, if we do choose to keep the roots in the ground in the garden throughout the winter time, the soil can freeze. We can get some pretty hard freezes, and so it can be difficult to get the roots out of the ground. So that's why there's a benefit to digging them up and storing them in some type of container with dirt or sand in it, or like in a root cellar, or drying it, you know, preserving it in some type of fashion. That way we don't have that accessibility issue quite so much. Over the years, I've also noticed a little bit of rodent damage to a few of the roots, but they don't really go after them, per my experience, a whole lot, not compared to other plants like sunchokes and things of that nature. But parsnips are usually pretty good in that respect. And then parsnips and a lot of other plants in the carrot family and in other plant families can contain furanocoumarins, which are types of plant secondary metabolites, right? They're phytochemicals. They can have some health promoting effects. They can also have some medicinal effects, but they can also, if consumed in excess, can cause photosensitivity in some individuals, right? Like if the plant sap of this plant gets on exposed skin, and then that skin gets exposed to sunlight, it could create like a rash or something. Some people may have a more prominent reaction than others, but that's just something to keep in mind. But also consider that usually around the time when I'm eating parsnips, personally I've never had an issue with this, but also usually when I'm eating parsnips, it's the time of the year when it's colder. I'm not outside as often, and if I am outside, I'm usually pretty well covered, right? Because it's usually cold and windy. So that really hasn't been an issue for me, but figured I'd put it out there anyway. All right, and then we have the berries, right? So I'm talking about the berries from the rubus genus. So these are gonna be like the wine berries, the raspberries, black raspberries, and blackberries, dewberries, all those kinds of berries. And so these plants are typically perennial, right? But they have biennial canes where each year the plant will produce first year canes, and they will just engage in shoot growth. And then the next year, those canes will flower and bear fruit, while the plant is sending up new canes that same year to grow shoots for fruit production in the next year. So these plants generally do really well in poor soil conditions. They're pretty drought tolerant as well. Even now in well, late fall now, we've been in a drought for like 2.5 months since August basically. These blackberries, you know, they still have their leaves, and they're not showing signs of distress. So these are some pretty hardy plants, right? And some of them are native as well, like the certain species of blackberries or black raspberries. So they can be naturally adapted to this type of climate as well. In North America. These berries are generally pretty high in vitamin C and a bunch of other phytonutrients, antioxidants, anthocyanins, salvestrols, all those different beneficial compounds. This can be really good for our health, right? And especially during the winter time, these berries can be dried. They can be dried into a fruit leather and preserved that way. But then that leather can also be broken up into little bits and added to pemmican and other nutrient-dense foods as well, right? So it can really be a nice, efficient, and effective, healthful food that we can incorporate into our diet, and we can preserve them during the months of the year when we may not have as much access to vitamin C rich foods. So also the dried canes of some of these species, I know I've used the wineberry canes. They can be dethorned, right? You take a knife or a rock and you can scrape the thorns off carefully, and these can make really good hand drill stalks for fire starting. Certain species are going to have certain types of canes that are more conducive to this than others. You know, each species kind of has its own personality, right? So practice and experimentation is really what's going to key in on that. And the leaves have also been used as a tea for a lot of these species, you know, blackberries, wineberries, and those kinds of things. Some challenges, some things to keep in mind with these types of berries are, of course, birds. For me, I haven't found them to be a huge challenge, but they can go after them to some extent. They can peck at the berries a little bit. I have punctured holes in pie tins and strung those out across the rows of vines that I have. I don't know how effective or not effective those are because they have a shiny reflective surface, but they also, when the wind blows, they can bang against the metal fencing that I have supporting the blackberries, and they can make some noise in that way too. Other than that, I just kind of deal with it, you know. Sometimes the birds need to eat too, and you know, I mean, if you're really gung-ho, you might be able to rig up some netting that you can, you know, pull out over the berries. Really, for me, it's just timing, you know, going out to pick the berries as soon as they're ripe, and trying to not waste any time. So certain species like the black raspberry or the wineberry can produce pretty small berries, and so in some respects this can be time consuming to collect. So we want to be mindful of the whole calories in, calories out concept. What is going to make the most sense? And also some of these species can be susceptible to an orange rust. This can kind of deform the plant's growth, and it may affect its productivity and longevity over time, and that's one thing to keep in mind. Thank you so much for checking out this video on my top 5 crops on what can be grown effectively if you actually have to like really produce food for yourself, your family, your loved ones. And definitely let me know in the comments if you had to grow your own food or most of your own food, what would be your top crops. So thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.